Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, desolate, peasants, vassals, minions, robots. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go global again. And I'm going to do probably what's going to be kind of a long video on robots and their effect on the future, particularly employment. And this is a video I've wanted to do for a long time and a big topic. And I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of my compatriots and friends here on YouTube and friends here at home. And it becomes this constant discussion and dynamic between, well, will all these robots come in, replace a lot of jobs, but then there will be an industry that grows up to service the robots or replace all these jobs, or will these robots basically displace a lot of workforces? I tend to fall in the camp that this time will not be, or this time will be different, in that the new jobs will not arise to service this robotic industry. There's just too much built-in longevity. And just like we see cars now that can go 100,000 miles without being serviced, there's just these robots are going to be efficient. I just don't see that industry happening. Although there's one argument that more tasks will be replaced and not necessarily occupations. And I can certainly see that partially. And so in that sense, I'm a little more optimistic that maybe it will be just be tasks that are replaced and not so much occupations. But most everything I've seen seems to be about replacing occupations. And there's quite a bit out there, and I've been following this for a while. So there's going to be a lot of links below. But let's get into this. So a little bit historically, of course, we've had the sewing machine, the reaper, the cotton gin, the assembly line, the radio, the telephone, the personal computer, mobile telephones, and the internet. They all created jobs, and all these technologies had one thing in common. They were price deflationary, and the fact that the technology actually drove a lot of prices down and made labor more valuable. And the fact that robotics are going to be a little different than this is one of the things that makes one pessimistic. But we can see certainly the past is in historical example is what people are using when they look at items like these and realize that, well, yeah, a lot of occupations became irrelevant and were replaced. They were anachronistic, but new ones grew up to replace them. And like I say, we're not really seeing that now. And there's been plenty of examples already. People don't necessarily think of this as robotics, but these are the first steps in robotics and showing what they're going to do in our modern society. One example is ATMs. So automatic teller machines, people don't think about anymore, but they replace tens of thousands of bank teller jobs. That used to be a huge industry for low-skill workers, high school workers, college grads, and no longer. Anybody that's ever been in a bank recently in the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years knows that. Another example is 27 million Americans use TurboTax to prepare their taxes. So an entire industry of tax consultants were put out of business, and 27 million Americans using that service is people essentially moving over to robotics. And another example we've seen recently that people haven't discussed is now we have these new online mortgage services. You can actually just go online, push some buttons, and get the whole mortgage process going. And if that technology catches on, then entire mortgage industry is going to be decimated. All these people servicing mortgages and everything attached to that. So anyway, today we live in a world where central bank, of course, insists on price rises, and that's part of it too. We used to live in a world where the idea was to kind of keep prices the same and have some stability. And before the central banks, that was true. But we live in an era where prices must rise, and therefore that's another thing that will eventually encourage more robotics. And so anyway, let's look at some of these studies and things that are out there that discuss the idea of robotics and what it will do in the future. There's a German study by Inga Diba that said that 59% of Germany's workforce could be replaced by machines and software in the coming decades. They currently have 30 million workers, and they imagine that 18 million of those jobs will be lost to robotics. And there's evidence to support some of these views that are coming up in these studies as well, because as I've discussed in other videos, not all the attrition of jobs in the United States is due to just shipping things overseas to Mexico and China. A lot of jobs are being replaced by automation. It's just not being discussed. And I'll bring that up in a few minutes too. A good example of that is Boeing and their move to automation. And those jobs haven't moved to China or South Carolina. They've just been eliminated by automation. So to go back to the study in Germany, it said the effects will be worse in Germany because of its strong industrial sector, and whole sectors could easily be switched over to robotics. And so in the long run, countries that still have a strong industrial base, ironically, are going to be the ones whose workforce is the most affected by robotics. And these factory workers and administrative armies at companies like VW and BMW will all be eliminated. And the German study goes on to say that 86% of administrative workers could be replaced by machines as well, which is no surprise. And then 76% of mechanics and machine operators, mechanical technicians, could be replaced as well. So pretty sober look at a German industrial economy that could suffer from robotics, and certainly the United States has a lot of kinship to that, and so something to think about. And then we have a study done by Stuart Elliott, an economic analyst, and he specializes in robotics and its effect on the workforce, and he's interested in artificial intelligence, language, reasoning, vision, and movement. And that's part of the argument I think some people don't grasp, is just how sophisticated artificial intelligence and robotics and the juxtaposition of those two will increase the capacity for robotics to replace humans. So something that shouldn't be underestimated. But Stuart Elliott goes on to say, quote, during the 21st century, I think it will become technically possible to automate essentially all human jobs, unquote. I think that's pretty realistic. I think people will be surprised at the ways that robotics are being applied, and the studies that are being done on how robotics can be applied. And so he's suggesting that more like 90% of all jobs could be replaced. And certainly you have to factor in the time frame when you're talking about that kind of job loss. It could be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. But at the rate of development in artificial intelligence and robotics right now, I would suggest that it's going to be more in the 10 to 20 to 30 year zone. So then we have another study out of Oxford University in 2013 that came to the same conclusion. They only figured that jobs that are completely based on social skills will be somewhat protected, and that seems like a fair assumption. And I have a lot of examples of companies that are already using robotics, and that's one of the number of reasons why I'm fairly pessimistic when we see the rate of application of robotic technologies now. There's a farm here in Illinois, so largest indoor vertical farm in North America with 90,000 square feet, and they grow basil, mint, lettuce, and kale, and that's the model for the future, is these indoor vertical garden facilities, and they don't use soil and sunlight, and they have these robots that can harvest massive amounts. In fact, a Japan company called Spread has the world's first robot-run farm. It can produce 30,000 heads of lettuce a day, and the robots plant the seeds, water the plants, and trim the lettuce heads. And their labor cost has been reduced by 50%. You'd think it would be even more. And more importantly, the energy use has been reduced by 30%. And then in places like this, 98% of the water is recycled as well. But so that's an example of the future. And also, I've read about robotics in the United States, particularly applying to fields across the United States and large farms, and particularly industrial farms. They have the robotics now that have the sensitivity to be able to pick strawberries and not damage them and tell when they're ripe and all sorts of things. And so one has to extrapolate when you imagine that when they finally get robots that can work all the fields in the United States, for example, what's going to happen to that massive migrant agricultural culture that has grown up in the United States? It seems likely that they will all be replaced. And So that obviously has huge implications. In China, in May 2015, we have a manufacturing hub that is starting work on the first zero labor factory. It's going to be 90% robotics, 1,000 robots eventually. Currently, the company's had 2,000 workers, and they're down to 200 already. And then pretty soon they're going to have 1,000 robots. And so part of this is every example that is built like these companies that I'm talking about is going to set an example for other corporations. And so the more successful these prototypes are, the faster we're going to see this spread. And part of it too, of course, is that it's now economic. Previously, it was cost prohibitive, and the cost ratio of replacing a human worker was not as efficient as it is now. And the fact that they can have retail robots in manufacturing assembly plants and fast food and that sort of thing now, where you can buy a robot for $20,000 or less, it becomes very economically encouraging to replace these workers with robots, cost effective. And that's another reason why I argued in my video that the minimum wage is kind of a moot point, because the move to robotics and automation is going along so quickly that we will hardly have time to instigate a lot of these higher wage scales. And so let's go back to some of these robotics. There's a company, Oshbot, that works with Lowe's, and they're Lowe's Innovation Labs, and they of course are working on robots that will work in their stores, and they have product scanners, obstacle avoidance, autonomous navigation, customer engagement, including multiple languages. So what an advantage there to have robots that speak every language on earth, and a great asset to have for a lot of companies. And then of course they're voice activated, and these are being used in San Jose stores now as of the last couple of years, so they are already in operational. We have Amazon moving all to robotics, and I've seen number of stories. I don't have them included below, but Amazon has definitely moved a lot over to robotics and automation. And then we have in Sweden the first unstaffed grocery store use a cell phone application for even opening the store, getting in the store, and then buying things. But they have surveillance and protection, but obviously something like that would be ripe for theft. One of the reasons why they don't carry alcohol, apparently. And then the UK, 2017, they're going to start fleet testing of driverless trucks, and Japan expects to have driverless taxis by 2020 for the Tokyo Olympics. So that's another part of the robotics automation quotient that's going to replace a lot of working class jobs, and that is driverless trucks, and they're being tested and used in the United States as well and all over the world. So that technology is advancing quickly, and driverless cars, driverless taxis are replacing taxi drivers, replacing truck drivers. Once again, massive displacement of lower class and working class and middle class citizens. And then the story I mentioned earlier, perfect example of what robotics is doing and how it is automation that is a threat, along with outsourcing jobs all over the world. Boeing in 1967, Washington State Boeing had 120,000 employees and delivered 300 airplanes, and that was 400 employees per plane. But by 2015, the company in Washington has 79,300 employees and delivered 700 planes, twice that, with 113 employees per plane, a third. So very striking example of how robotics already, just within the last 50 years, at a major company like Boeing, has replaced a lot of the labor force. In fact, since 1967, there's been a 72% reduction of human labor at Boeing. So a good example of what's to come. And in fact, in South Carolina, robots will replace manual drilling by 80% at Boeing, so they're not going to need any of those workers anymore. And in Everett, Washington, Boeing is building a robotic fuselage assembly plant and already has robotics trying to assemble wing sections. So they have obviously huge plans to replace even more Boeing workers with a massive amount of automation. And then locally, as we've talked about before in the United States, we see this low level replacement, and this is where it gets to the heart of why the minimum wage is a moot point because of automation. We have Panera Bread that has a self-service order kiosks. Applebee's and Chili's have stores that are moving to these table tablets, and they're starting to eliminate waiters. And I don't have to tell anybody that if we, particularly when we have a vast corporate food sector, if they start replacing all their waiters and these type of workers, then once again there's going to be a massive displacement of low skill workers, lower class workers, and middle class workers, and certainly their management and their accounting will also be replaced by robots. And in fact, a CNN report said that robots will replace most fast food workers. And as I mentioned in that other video, they have chef robots that can cook any number of recipes, thousands of recipes you can program into them. And they have hamburger flipping robots. I think there's restaurants in Japan that already use all robots. University of Oxford study says that 92% chance of fast food preparation and serving being fully automated in coming decades. So, like I say, massive displacement. And even delivery drivers, even your pizza delivery drivers, and food delivery drivers, and any kind of couriers are going to be replaced by self-driving cars and drones. So once again, a massive sector of lower class and working class workers to be displaced. And another one is a 2013 study, The Future of Employment, How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization? And it gives a huge list. I'll attach it below, but it gives percentages, including cartographers. 87% of cartographers will be eliminated. 80% of electrical drafters will be eliminated. And it includes everybody from umpires, technical writers, translators, tax preparers, accountants and auditors, credit counselors, editors, maids and housekeepers, janitors, roofers, carpenters, paralegals, court reporters, bakers, jewelers, optometrists, dentists, telemarketers, cashiers, insurance agents, taxi drivers, truck drivers, and librarians. All will be replaced by automation and robots. And the list just goes on and on. So the conclusion, like I say, there's a kind of a dynamic between people who think that robotics and automation will blossom and that new technologies and servicing of that sector will create all its new jobs, or the other scenario where there'll be massive displacement. As I've stated frequently, I believe in the massive displacement. And one of the things that's kind of evidence of that in a way, and at least if you kind of look at the world through the conspiratorial lens, suppose the government and the corporations know there's going to be mass displacement in the future by automation, and that's tied in with FEMA camps that are all empty right now. There might not be mass unrest and civil war in America like a lot of fearmongers think, because of what we see now and all this political divide and all the race war talk and everything else. But I've definitely seen more likely to see a massive unrest, kind of what they envision in China, when basically whole sectors are displaced. And right now it's balanced out by low labor participation. A lot of people, and then young people that can't get jobs living at home. So that's kind of absorbing it right now. But when we get to the point where a lot more people are just thrown out on the streets, particularly when you get your working class thrown out in the streets and these low-end jobs eliminated, and then the middle class, when the middle class starts getting more decimated, then the unrest could become more of a reality. So it could very well be tied into the vision that people have of why we need camps and what's going to happen in the future. Of course, one other option is the idea of a universal basic income. And we live in a neoliberal state right now, certainly with Democratic administrations and Republican as well, where a great portion of the population relies, and certainly corporations too, there's corporate subsidies and welfare, but we have a welfare nation where everybody has a bit of the government tit, and that includes middle class people who write off their mortgages and get subsidies and tax returns and things like that. and then includes all the way down to people who just live on government welfare. But a universal basic income is something people have discussed before, and might become more of a necessity. But that also has its pitfalls. Mass unemployment certainly has its pitfalls, but getting everyone hooked up to the government, making everyone basically dependent on the government, could create a lot of problems in itself, particularly because everyone would have to support whatever the government does, and relies on the government could be cut off at any point. So the leaning towards fascist tendencies can also be increased by the neoliberalism of a universal basic income. But it's certainly a very real possibility, considering what the future might bring. And then another part of this whole scenario of automation and robotics could have an unexpected side effect too, which is the elimination of small and medium business sectors. And as robotics become regular in corporate America, it might give them just enough of an economic edge that we're going to see a massive decimation of small and medium-sized businesses, which is also part of the futuristic scenario that people picture. So none of it's a surprise, and all of it goes hand in hand. But there you have it. There's my big video on robotics, and unfortunately, a somewhat pessimistic view of the future of what robotics and automation is going to do to the working class, not just here in the United States, but globally. So I think we have more to fear from that than necessarily World War III. I'm useful, idiot. Don't you be one too?